I'll hopefully be able to answer anything you have. Thanks.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Stringer, and I'm the Director of Ecosystem Planning for the Pacific Southwest region of the Forest Service, stationed out of Vallejo, and basically we're responsible, kind of oversee the management of the National Forest System lands, the 18 National Forests in California. And then we also have responsibility for some of the Pacific Islands and the Commonwealths there. But what I'd like to do real quick, given the size of this group, I'd like to just basically have everyone go around and just introduce themselves and affiliations, or if they're just here as an individual, that would be wonderful too. And start right here with you, Jay, if we could.
I'm Jay Miller. I work for the U.S. Forest Service, the regional office, fire and aviation. My office is in this building, and I'm responsible for the landscape fire effects monitoring for the region.
My name is George Gentry. I'm the Executive Officer of the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. Everyone calls me YG. No, that doesn't mean young gangster. So I do see there is a rapper named YG performing this week in Sacramento. I don't know how to rap. YG stands for Young Girl. My dad was known as OG Old Girl. We were both foresters, so I have a long association which is really.
I'm Dan Tomaszewski. I'm Vice President of Sierra
I'm Ian Romapa with the Sierra Club.
Go ahead. What was it?
John Moore, no conspicuous affiliation.
Hey, could y'all speak up when you do introduce yourselves so the people around the room?
Pardon?
Just speak up loudly when you.
John Moore, Sacramento, no conspicuous affiliation, but a long-time interest in the subject.
I'm Mark Stanley. I'm actually retired Chief Deputy Director for the Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, and currently working for the Sierra Nevada Conservancy as their forestry and fire specialist.
And I'm Chris Dallas. I'm also with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. I am not a forest or fire specialist, I'm a generalist.
Denise Tolney, Forest Service, Sierra National Forest, the Forest Fuels Officer there.
I'm Sid Beckman. I work for the National Park Service. I'm the Regional Fire Management Officer for the Pacific West region.
I'm John Clark. I'm on detail to the Regional Office in Public Affairs, Forest Service.
Severity with Sierra Forest Legacy.
I'm John Gallo from the Wilderness Society.
Tiffany Meyer from CAL FIRE Fire Resource Assessment Program.
Joe Sherlock with the Forest Service.
John Segura with the El Dorado chapter of Trout Unlimited and the State Council of Trout Unlimited.
I'm Pat Kidder, retired from Bureau Land Management. I'm a State Fire and Aviation Officer here in the state for a few years. Currently the Chairman of the California Fire Safe Council.
Ian Romapa from Sierra Club.
Randy Strickland, Fire Ecologist, Lake Elevation, Forest Service.
I'm Justin Weinstein, Center for Biological Diversity.
Oh, I'm April Breff. I do GIS at the Regional Office for the Forest Service.
Well, thanks everyone. I'm going to, before we introduce the panel, I'm going to just kind of give a really broad overview of our planning process, where we are in the planning process, and some of the differences maybe between our planning processes of the past and where we hope to go with our new planning process. And we have a new planning rule that was promulgated last year in 2012. We're right now looking at the assessment phase for 3 national forests in California, the Inyo, the Sierra, and the Sequoia. So in the assessment phase is the first place. We're also doing a bioregional assessment, which just means we're trying to take a landscape look at issues across the Sierra Nevadas. And so we can look at that broader view, but also connect it with the individual and unique issues that the individual forests have. So the assessment phase is where we are right now. We basically kicked it off in January. Our bioregional assessment will be scheduled to be completed this summer, sometime I think in the end of July. And then the 3 forests, those individual assessments, we will have published at the end of this calendar year, end of 2013. And then we will start with what is the more formal NEPA process and start looking at preparing a draft forest plan. The assessment is basically a snapshot of the current trends and conditions across these landscapes. And we can use that assessment then to help us look at what's working and what do we need to change from the existing direction that we have in our forest plans based on new information, new stressors, different demands for society, population dynamic changes, whatever that may be. And so part of what we're doing right now, and one of the differences from our old planning processes, is I think how we're engaging the public and helping us figure that out at the beginning instead of us drafting something and saying, what do you think? We're asking you what you think and help write us as we think together. And that is really a major change. We are really looking at a different collaborative effort. All three forests have already developed collaboration plans. We have a regional collaboration plans working with the Sierra Cascade Dialogues. We're trying to work with the tribes differently and engage them. We're working a lot with other federal and state agencies differently and really trying to expand how we work together to, maybe a goal of actually having synchronized planning processes and how we can start looking at having common objectives across the landscape for these lands that we frequently share administrative responsibilities for. And another really big difference, if you look at some of the existing forest plans and how they discuss or don't discuss the role of fire on the landscape, and what we know now and how we really want to incorporate fire as a very active player in our plans and really look at, well, what is that role of fire? We have just the Pacific Southwest Research Station, we were working with them and they're publishing a science synthesis and looking at some of the latest science related to fire. We know there's just tons of information up there. What's its relevance to our forest planning process as we move forward? We know it has a lot of significance, but what exactly and how does that play out? How can we use fire as a management tool in the future that we have really maybe not done so good a job at in the past? We know that a lot of the suppression actions we've taken over the past century has led to a lot of change in the environmental and vegetative conditions that we have now. And that in turn has led to some of the issues we have to the severity of the wildfires we see and the subsequent ecological conditions that follow from those fires. We heard some of that yesterday when we were talking about some of the aquatic issues and riparian issues. And so how can we start thinking about a much more proactive approach to utilizing fire and at the same time acknowledging the risk that fire poses to a lot of the things we value, whether it's the investments that folks have made in the urban interface, the smoke issues that plays on a lot of folks' mind, especially the Central Valley. So those are all the issues we're just trying to get this discussion focused on and help us figure out as we move forward in planning. What do we need to do? So I'm going to leave that discussion right there because I'm hoping these folks give us all the good answers to this information today. But actually, we're trying to start this conversation because we know a lot of these things just don't have answers. We're going to be looking and trying to figure out how to manage it better than we have in the past, learn from it, monitor it, and then make adjustments so we can next go around manage it even better than we did this time. So with that, what I'm going to do is turn it over to Joanne. She's going to introduce the panel and look forward to having some really good discussion and dialogue today.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay, I'm going to use the microphone, and the panelists I'd like to use as well, and when we have questions and answers later, April or Joe will go around with the microphone so that we can record the conversation here. I've worn many hats in my career. Currently, I'm the regional planning ecologist for the Pacific Southwest region of the Forest Service, but I've spent 8 years working on fire behavior on fires, measuring them, and I'm still active in that. Last year I was on the Chips fire for quite a bit of time, on the Plumas and the Lassen, and also the Indian fire in the Inyo National Forest. So it's my pleasure here to introduce a couple of our speakers today, and I'm one of your speakers. I have to do both jobs. And in addition to learning from them, actually what's most important is when we have the conversation with all of you in the panel discussion. So the presentations will be relatively short. So Jay Miller works for the USDA Forest Service. He is responsible for the Pacific Southwest region's landscape level fire effects monitoring program. That's a mouthful, but it's very critical information I use all the time. He contributed to the development of some of the fire severity mapping protocols currently used nationally by the Forest Service. He has also co-authored several peer-reviewed journal articles on fire effects mapping and analyses of landscape-level fire patterns and trends in California. It's that landscape part that's very important. He holds a senior wildland fire ecologist certification from the Association of Fire Ecology. So Jay's going to talk about fire severity.
So I guess you can hear me since I can hear me crunching around over here. Okay, so we get started here. So I'm responsible for this landscape level fire effect monitoring program, like Joanne said. And what I've done, this is part of my job, is I've developed this GIS database for fires, wildland fires that occurred at least partially on Forest Service lands in the region. So using these data are representative of severity to vegetation, and they're calibrated to 3 variables that reflect severity to vegetation. The composite burn index, which is a field-based protocol which was developed by the USGS and the National Park Service, and also percent change in canopy cover and basal area, based upon treeless data similar to those collected by FIA. And we published those methods in a couple of papers a few years ago. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Transanalysis we've done for the Sierra Nevada. In 2008, we published the first paper and a companion report, and there's a few copies of this laying back here on the table if you want to arm wrestle, grab one. And then this last fall, we updated it with a new paper. And I want to point out that these are the only papers that have been peer-reviewed and published on severity trends in Sierra Nevada. So the next couple slides, I'm just going to talk about that latest paper. In that paper, we looked at all fires greater than 200 acres between 1984 and 2010 on Forest Service lands across the Sierra Nevada fire region, including the Cascade Mogollon. But we only looked at the portions of those fires that ended up or occurred on Forest Service managed lands. We also stratified those severity data by the three major forest types, mixed conifer, yellow pine, and red fir, as defined in Land Fire's BPS potential vegetation layer. Now that potential vegetation layer reflects where vegetation types could occur based upon their biophysical environment, such as topography, various variables calculated from topography and climate. And those vegetation types are regardless of their several stage. So here are some of the main results. What we found was that there was a statistically significant increasing trend in both percent and area of high severity in mixed conifer yellow pine systems per year. For red fir, there was no significant trend in percentage, and for area, it was just marginally significant. And these trends for yellow pine and mixed conifer, we ran a series of models and showed that there was actually no change in those trends from between 2004 to 2010. And as a converging line of evidence, we looked at the number of large fires that occurred since 1950, which is generally considered to be the era of modern fire suppression. And so what we have here is a bar chart, number of fires, and these are just large fires, and I mean, by large, I mean over 1,000 acres. And there's a significant increasing trend line here. And if you look at this, the last 17 years here is the longest period in this time series where there was at least one large fire, with 3 years here with 2 or 1 at the beginning of that series. The next longest series was back here in 68 through 75 of 8 years, and 5 out of those 8 years had only 1 or 2 fires, large fires. We also showed that the percentage of high severity in those large fires versus small fires, not by small I mean between 200 and 1,000 acres, was significantly different, and it was greater in the larger fires for that 84 to 2010 period. So if you extrapolate those kind of results back to 1950, it's pretty easy to see why we have that increase in percentage and area of high severity per year. So as I said, all the work that I've done is basically looked at, well, I should back up a bit. Primarily the work that I do is just looking at fires on Forest Service lands. And so Joanne asked me to talk a little bit about other off Forest Service lands and the differences in the methods that we use versus the data that you can find out there. So there's 3 national fire severity mapping programs that you can readily get severity data from. There's the BEAR, which has been around the longest, but their focus is soils. So for severity of vegetation, you really don't want to use those data. Then there's this Rapid Assessment of Vegetation Conditions, or RAVAGE. We started that here in California. Now it's being done on a national level. It is focused on vegetation, but only on Forest Service lands. So really that doesn't really help private lands or the Park Service either. And I want to point out that the methods that we use here, that I use for our Forest Service fires in this region, are very similar to these methods for RAVAGE, which in contrast, so that only leaves the Monitoring and Burn Severity Program, which they say their focus is vegetation, but there's a big difference in the methods that we use versus what MTVS uses. And the issues with those differences is we rejected those methods and came up with our own methods. And it primarily concerns these 2 issues, that The methods they use dictate that their maps be produced by visual analysis by an analyst sitting at a computer terminal in Salt Lake City or Sioux Falls, South Dakota. All they know about is that image that's on their computer screen. They basically have no information about on the ground. And the methods that they use can really underrepresent high severity fire and dry forests. And I want to explain why that's true. So now it all boils down to our definition of high severity. So here on the left we have an open stand and a closed stand on the right, both of them experiencing what we would call stand replacing fire or high severity fire. But satellite imagery that we use is sensitive to chlorophyll. So if you think about how much change in chlorophyll is here versus here, this is a much bigger number. And so this MTBS, they use what we call an absolute difference. They will take a post-fire image and subtract it from the pre-fire image. So if you have both of these kinds of conditions, stand conditions, pre-fire in the same fire, there's no way you can create a severity map that reflects high severity in both stands at the same time. And for an example, I'm just going to show you the boulder fire up on the Plumas. This is a pre-fire and post-fire aerial photos, and along the lake here it's pretty dense Douglas fir pine, and up on the slopes, open pine. Post-fire, you can see it was nuked here along the edge of the lake, and up here on these slopes up here. And as you can see in this MTBS map, they properly reflect this change down here along the lake, and some of this up here on the slopes, but not very well, as opposed to the Radish and our methods. So that's pretty much for my short little talk. If there's any questions.
We'll wait on the questions.
Okay.
Thank you, Jay. Okay, I'm going to change the order in the agenda a little bit because I'm in charge, so I get to do that. No, it makes logical sense, actually. The next speaker will be George Gentry, and I keep misspelling his name. I apologize, George. He is the Executive Officer of the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, and he's going to talk about the wildland-urban interface. And that's one of our key focal points this morning. So, thank you, George.
Sure.
Would you like the lights on?
Yeah. People, I need to make sure everybody's awake. No, I'll just use this.
Perfect.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I came up with my own definition of catastrophic fire some time back. It's the one where your house burns down. That's pretty catastrophic. Hello. Test me. A couple of years ago, somebody said that WUI was wrong, that it really should be called ooh-wee. I'm going to stick with WUI. So let me explain a little bit. I'm going to come at this from the perspective of how the board looks at wildland-urban interface, how we set our policies in place, and how we analyze. The first thing you need to know about the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection is it designates the areas known as state responsibility areas. And those areas are the areas where the board determines that the state has the financial responsibility for wildland fire protection. We have other criteria that go with that. But it basically comes down to 32 million acres of the state fall within the state responsibility area. And that's going to be one of the primary things. That's the universe of things we look at. Now you narrow this down to the wildland-urban interface and communities at risk. The first thing that I want to talk about is the 50,000 foot level. And since we have somebody here from the FRAP program, that's where it really kind of starts for the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. The board's required to do periodic updates and analysis of policy for the state. But it starts with an assessment by FRAP. And FRAP has done this for the board for a number of years. it kind of changed this last time around in 2010, mainly owing to the 2008 Farm Bill, which changed the redesign program. And so FRAP did some modifications to its overall strategy and report. If you go online to FRAP, you'll find Chapter 2.1 of that assessment, Wildfire Threat to Ecosystem Health and Community Safety. What I'm focusing on here is the community safety aspect. So the main thing it talks about, the way they designed this was to talk about the assets at risk and the threats. And that, combined together, would identify priority landscapes for treatment. So, to pick up where Jay left off, the first finding of the FRAP program was large damaging fires continue to plague California, and that they destroyed over 2,000 structures in both 2007 and 2008. Future forecasts implicating more fire with expansion of the wildland-urban interface due to ignition potential. So when we look at the analysis for WUI, we look at the structures, major roads, and the transmission lines. Those are the assets at risk that we're really looking at. And then we look at the threats. And by threats, of course, we're specifically talking about the probability of fire and fire behavior. Those two things combined. The assets, that's the risk. That defines the priority. So, FRAP went on to identify in its report that the housing asset identifies concentrations of human settlement and also serves as a proxy for additional human infrastructure that is at risk to damage from wildfire. Higher housing density results in higher asset ranks. In addition, a higher rank is assigned to the 150-foot buffer around major transportation routes as well as major transmission lines. The composite asset is a high priority is given to dense housing, and a medium ranking is given to major roads and transmission line buffers. When generating the composite asset, housing is weighted 3 times as much as the transmission lines and the roads. So that's how they came about with their ranking. Another thing that factors into this is that the department was required to come up with the fire hazard severity zone ratings. That's a unique data set that we've incorporated into this ranking priority. It's also primarily for helping to develop building code standards. I'll come back to building code standards a little bit later as we move further along in this discussion. So what did the assessment find? They found the top 5 counties based on acres and high priority landscape were Los Angeles, San Diego, Riverside, San Bernardino, and Orange. In other words, Los Angeles had 187,000 acres of high priority landscape. But they went further in terms of how they defined all this, because they went to the top 5 communities based on population in the high priority landscape. So, as you might expect, Los Angeles, San Diego, Santa Clarita, Thousand Oaks, Oakland. That's an important one to remember. There's a lot of issues that come up in the East Bay. From that, working with the board, FRAP designed what's known as the strategies document. So what we come up with is a set of strategies, and it draws upon something called the Strategic Fire Plan, which I'll also address in just a minute. But the effect of population growth on the WUI results in more complex and expensive emergency response efforts. That's intuitively obvious, I'm sure, to all of you. Conversion for new housing continues on rangelands and forests near metropolitan areas and in the wildland-urban interface. Where once only natural resources were threatened by wildland fire in these areas, threats now extend to life and property. The delivery of wildland fire protection services in California relies on an integrated, multi-agency effort to maximize the use of the resources. There's a lot of cross-cutting issues. I want to tie back to some of the things that Joanne said that we should address. There's a lot of cross-cutting issues that interface with this whole notion. Forest pest threats. We've seen this firsthand in places like Lake Arrowhead, where you have a massive insect outbreak, massive dieback, sudden oak death, and now the gold-spotted oak borer. All these things are like increasing wildland-urban interface threats. Climate change factors in. Water quality and supply. And lastly, a cross-cutting issue is emerging markets, particularly those related to biomass, so that you have some way of utilizing materials from these wildland-urban interfaces and creating cost-effective solutions to treating them. All these are identified in the strategy report. It goes into further detail, but I'm not going to go into those right now. I'd like to go to the next level, which is the strategic fire plan. Now, this is the second one we've had. The first one was, we've had several of them, but we had one in '96 that was trying to reduce costs and losses. But it was an extremely complex task to model. A few years ago, we engaged in an effort to focus the fire plan on a more strategic level. What we came up with was, and I'll just summarize the goals real quickly, improved availability and use of information on hazard and risk assessment, land use planning, including general plans, new development, and existing developments, shared vision among communities and the multiple fire protection jurisdictions, including county-based plans and community-based plans, such as community wildfire protection plans, establishing fire resistance and assets at risk, such as homes and neighborhoods, a shared vision among multiple fire protection jurisdictions and agencies, levels of fire suppression and related services, and post-fire recovery. And we outline strategies in here for approaching each one of these things. So just to recap, we have the overall FRAP assessment, strategies identified in there. Now we're talking about the strategic fire plan, which is another level. What's the main function of this document? Well, its primary purpose to me is to make a clear statement of what our overall intent is, but also to tell the units of CAL FIRE what we expect for them in evaluating how their units will approach their own priorities. Interestingly enough, we just received our update on the fire plan. And this is important, I think, for everyone to understand. There was a workshop sponsored by the National Institute on Standards and Training in August of last year, I believe it was. So they did a survey. The workshop provided an opportunity for experts in WUI fire behavior, engineered fire protection technologies, fire-resistant design, standard test methods, and WUI building and fire codes to collectively determine the areas of research which will have the most impact in mitigating hazards associated with WUI fires. The workshop proceedings report describes and documents the research needs. A summary is this. Rank number 1, hardened building structures, exteriors, including decks. Rank 2, specify performance standards. Rank 3, understand ignition phenomena. Rank 4, education, ignition prevention, all parties involved in conversation. Rank 5, improved tools for post-fire evaluation. Those were the top ones. At the bottom, you get into social, local grassroots inspections and self-enforcement, research fire resistance materials, standardized defensible spaces, increased fire engine crew size, new codes focused on ignition and fire resistance. So you see that what the basic thing of this survey of these WUI fire folks was understanding how to harden building structures. Because if there's one thing that we've seen over the last few years for most of these fires, ember intrusion has become a critical factor in determining what will happen. I think Angora saw a lot of that. A lot of houses, most of the houses I would say, were lost by ember intrusion. So hardening structures becomes a very high priority. So the unit fire plan builds on this strategic fire plan. And they identify priorities. Time? Okay. They identify their priorities. As an example, and these are all available on the website, this is the Amador El Dorado Unit Fire Plan. And they set their unit goals. Their number one goal, engage and participate with local stakeholder groups, i.e. fire safe councils and others, to validate and prioritize assets at risk. That kind of communication is extremely important. I want to kind of wrap this up a little bit. From there, the board does regulations. There's 4291, which a lot of people are familiar with. That's defensible space regulations in and around homes. There's 4290, which covers the minimum state standards for things like ingress and egress and water supply in developments. The Office of the State Fire Marshal develops building codes, which address things like hardened structures. And finally, there's the safety element review, which is covered under government code. And a lot of people aren't aware of the board's involvement there, but this has to do with planning for development in areas. So counties, when they revise their safety element, are required by law to send their safety element to the board for review and comment. The rules to that have slightly changed in the last year due to Senate Bill 1241. But you can see that when we look at WUI, what we are looking at is a comprehensive way of looking at it. There's planning, there's the hardening of the structure, there's the defensible space, there's fuel treatments. All these things marry together into one thing. I also point out too that if you go on the Office of Planning and Research website, you'll see a fire hazard planning general plan technical advice series document, which basically categorizes and catalogs all these things. We're in the process of reviewing it. It was done in 2003, but it's a handy compendium of all the things that affect WUI and how you should go about planning in the WUI. So I'll wrap it up right there. Sorry to take so long.
Thank you, George. Okay, I'm going to talk about wildlands and the wildland-urban interface here. Just a second. Dave Sapsis, the fire scientist from FRAP, will be here later this afternoon. And I just want to say that there's an interagency group working on these fire issues together. So what FRAP is working on, we're working on, the Sierra Conservancy, Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, we're all working together because these things should all be considered in the same way. So I don't have the map that I'm showing today, but for the wildland-urban interface, it was pretty easy to agree upon what kind of fire, how to assess fire in that area, and that is based upon fire suppression. So a few people disagree on that, and it depends more on people's view on how far out you go. So in the immediate area, you know, we're looking at expected fire behavior for the most part with flame lengths less than 4 feet where firefighters can safely go in there and you don't have many embers generated from that. Now, beyond that, we have to look at the bigger landscape. And one of the things of the new planning rule is it talks about ecological integrity. What does that mean? One of the things that the Forest Service has tried to do in the past is, you know, look at one species at a time to spot it out. And that is actually a very complex question these days. We used to think it was simple. High severity fire, you get high severity effects, it's all bad. It turns out we really don't know what proportion of that owl location can have different severities of fire and that owl still is able to reproduce and survive. We do know that if you look at the type of effects that are down on that lower slide there, where it's uniformly that way, that is not good for the owl, and then that's happening increasingly. So one of the things I did, I'm kind of getting back at this fire resilience question from an ecological perspective here, is I looked at all of the owl locations, and I went back to 2001, because if we look at the ones now, we don't know how many have been lost due to fire, and the owl numbers change over time. I was talking to the ranger yesterday from the Feather River District on the Plumas, and she says, well, we keep finding new ones there. That's not necessarily the trend everywhere, but sometimes when we survey more, we find more, especially in those productive, wetter sites. One of the things that's clear using Jay's fire severity data is we're finding certain locations where there's a lot more effect of fire on owl packs, the protected activity centers, than the rest. And these shaded red areas are areas of concern for spotted owl that Dr. Jerry Werner, the owl scientist, came up with in 1992. So the thing I look at is from the big picture perspective, are we going to end up with some other areas of concern? This area on the Plumas and the Lassen, where we've had repeated large fires, is something going on there. Down in the south, who knows? That may be a different story because they do tend to have a more mixed severity in the landscape. So I asked the question, I don't know, is our fires good or bad? I don't think anybody's answered that. The one thing I did ask the owl scientists is, because I study fire behavior models and I'm out there measuring and looking at fire behavior, I said, what if your assumptions about the Farsight model are wrong? What if fires are getting more intense? What if the Farsight model does not reflect the explosive nature of fires that we're seeing these days? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, I think they are becoming wrong. So how do we get at this? I'm an ecologist. I've studied fire history, and I used to think that was the only way to go. We had to measure the fire scars, and we had to reconstruct what occurred historically, and people kept hitting me over the head and said, you know what? We have what we have now. We can't necessarily go back to some panacea in the past. It's a good information, but it doesn't necessarily tell us everything. But there is some good information there. One of it is looking at the historic mean fire return interval, how often fire used to occur there. And we can look at the departure with what is there now. So if fire used to occur very frequently in the yellow pine, on average every 10 years, and now it occurs sporadically, that means there's a big departure. So that's telling us something, and it's certainly telling us something about the ecological integrity of vegetation types that used to have a lot of fire in them. It was an important process. It played a role in reducing that understory regeneration layer, keeping pine in there, a lot of understory plants, recycling nutrients, invigorating the understory shrubs for forage. So it does tell us about the fire deficit, but we have to remember that it assumes that we know everything about historic fire return intervals. I'm wiser and older now and more humble. The older I get, the more I know we don't know everything. It assumes further that the mean tells us all that there's no fire effects, and that the mean is the the most important. Well, I teach here at the academy, and sometimes I tell the fire folks the mean is meaningless. Would you rather have Barry Bonds on your team who has a high RVI, or would you rather have Hank Aaron who might have an equivalently good RVI? Which one doesn't have a very good record when it comes to the end of the season? Barry Bonds. So it's not just the mean that's important. Sometimes it's those tails of the distribution. And the same thing with fire. Do you really think that ponderosa pine and mixed conifer burn every 10 years? No. It may have burned 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years between fires. So that can be very important in understanding how fire affects the landscape. And it also, you know, the return interval doesn't tell us about the ecological effects or desired conditions that we have as humans for other resource values. So another approach to do that we discussed and agreed upon with this interagency group, in addition to looking at the fire threat and fire probability, etc., that George talked about, and we're looking at all those, you can see that on the wiki, is looking at ecological resilience. So resilience means that when you have a fire come through, or drought, or anything else, insects and disease, there's still function after that comes through. Because if we really pretend that fires, we can totally control it, that's, you know, putting shelters on our eyes, putting our heads in the sand. Fire's going to be here. It's just a matter of what it's going to look like. So the way I've experimenting, and I'm the first to say it, and I need a lot of good input and comments on that, is to look at the current landscape patterns of severity that Jay talked about, and fire type. Is it crown fire or surface fire? And look at that relative to desired conditions and or ecological function. So function may be providing habitat to the spotted owl. That may be one function. And is that function within a current desired range or natural range of variability? This can be readily measured and tracked using predicted crown fire activity with fire behavior models that are standard, and fire severity monitoring that Jay conducts for us. So both of these things are useful. So what I've been working on is to come up with this potential fire behavior by fire type, and Phil Bowden, our fuel specialist for the region, is working on this with national land fire data. We can also drill this down to more locally appropriate data. And looking at big watersheds, because it doesn't make sense to say, well, this patch is high severity, this patch is low severity, this patch is crown fire, this patch is surface. When fire covers large areas, you have to think about what proportion in a large area, and what are those proportions now? So Neil Sugihara and Robin Wills of the Park Service and Yaman Wagtanang, retired from the USGS, and Neil from the Forest Service, we came up with this approach, and they participated at different levels. But they trust me, because some of them participated less, but liked the idea. So looking at this approach, divided up the landscape into major ecological zones or ecosystems. And I'm going to explain how this applies to the WUI influence zone in a minute too. So for the montane dry, ponderosa pine, Jeffrey pine, eastside pine, drier mixed conifer. Resilient would be that we have more than 75% surface fire and less than 25% crown fire. It's mostly surface fire. A low deviation, you'd start to mix it more to 50-50. A high deviation, you'd have it flipped. You'd have less than 25% surface and greater than 75% crown. How did I come up with these percents? I made them up. But I made them up based upon my knowledge of what occurred historically and my experience working with people, including people like you. What do people tend to find acceptable? I also made it up based upon my experience working on fires with a lot of fire incident management teams and firefighters. If you look at the moisture types, like the west side of the Plumas, you might expect that a little more is acceptable. Greater than 60% surface, less than 40% crown. When those tend to burn, that tends to be more of what happens. It tends to be more of what happened historically. Red fir, more of an equal mix, and subalpine and shrub non-forest There we have to use the FRAP because the crown fire concept is based upon forested systems. It could be we end up using flame length or rate of spread instead. Now, what about the wildland-urban interface? Well, I've had a lot of discussions with people, and this is where you tend to have the most disagreement with people with different viewpoints of what needs to occur on the landscape. The reality is, when you're within 1¼ miles, which is one of the outer zones that FRAP defines, fire's going to influence what comes in there. When you're 5 miles out, fire's going to influence what comes in there. Embers can travel up to 2 miles sometimes. If there's a crown fire coming at me within a mile, I don't want to be there as a firefighter. So the ecological approach that I thought would be useful to consider is, what if we apply this dry montane standard to that influence zone of the WUI, no matter where you were. So even if you're up in the Lake Tahoe Basin, where there's more red fir and lodgepole pine, or even if you're around Lake Oroville, where you have more of this mesic, apply this standard where it's greater than 75% surface fire. And the nice thing about this approach is it doesn't tell you how you have to treat it. It doesn't tell you that it has to be uniform. It tells you, use your landscape that you have and try to meet this objective. What does it look like? We're tweaking it still. And my friend April over there and I are working really hard. And we have to tweak it because some of the fire behavior data is difficult to apply across the whole bioregion because weather's tricky to do that with. But, as you might expect, a lot of it is at a high deviation from baseline. And there's much more that's a moderate deviation, and the part that's the tan that's resilient is a subalpine. I haven't tried to apply it, well, we have tried it, we just are not quite there yet, with the east side, the non-forest, and the foothill portions. But these are from large watershed scales, and we'll see what everybody thinks of this. So the only other thing I'm going to do really quick, and I'm going to modify our agenda and give you a break after I do this, and then we'll have the panel questions and answers. So I want to show you the framework that we're using to integrate social and ecological and economic aspects. This is the biggest job that the regional planning team has. And I want to know if you think we're on the right track or not, because this is really the most important thing and the most different thing we're doing with current forest plan revision. We're looking at this big area, with a lot of diverse social and economic situations and ecological. And the triple bottom line, those of you that were here yesterday were part of a discussion working on this. You can see that the triple bottom line, and I might have a slide later, Sue, or I do for this afternoon. Really, this is not meant to, it's meant to incorporate the triple bottom line, but not display it in those circles. It's meant to highlight what are the important interactions and influences. In the past, the Forest Service spent a lot of time working over here on the ecological system and the plan. And then we were surprised later why we got sued, taken to court, and no one liked what we did, and there's a contentious public, because, you know, it's public lands, it's not Forest Service lands, and people in the United States are not the same, and that's okay, and that's good, and that's part of our society. But what it means is that we need to deal with that up front. We need to deal with that human element up front. We need to deal with things that affect that up front. We need to deal with what people want out of it up front. So an example of that with fire, and this is what Mark and Sonia and Carla and I are working on next month, is looking at this thing in an issue and coming up with the actual bioregional assessment that will only be 40 pages, a lot shorter. So if we look at the influences, we have climate change, we have politics, we have air quality, we have growing populations, we have growing wildland-urban interface, and we have fire that's going to do what it does. And these things, there's no one-way arrow. So the human element over here, we elect the politicians. They come to fires and influence the suppression on fires. The public has different feelings about it when the fire is right there. People that are living in the city has a different viewpoint than people that live in the small rural communities. These are important things to recognize, that they influence the drivers and stressors. They influence all these things. Then we come over to the ecological or the ecosystem side. These are dependent on what happens with the drivers and stressors, the management, and they affect the ecosystem services down here. So, what kind of fire do you have? What kind of effects? What kind of riparian areas? What kind of landscape do you have that wildland-urban interface is within? And these affect the services, whether they are understory plants, rare and endangered plants, fish species that we utilize, all kinds of things. So these all go together. Now let's look at the real one we're using, which is very complicated, and you'll get to look at it a little bit later. This is all the elements that we are really trying to consider, and what I'm going to ask you to do after we take a break in the panel discussion is, if we have time, sit down and tell us which parts of these ecosystem services you find most important. What are the ecological components you feel are most important? The human elements, the drivers, the stressors. What is the issue? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? What do we need to change? So, now I'd like the panel to come back up. Actually, I'm sorry. It is hard work to organize a workshop. So, let's take a break for 15 minutes, come back here at 10 till, and then we'll have the panel discussion. I think it'll work better that way.